All right, in this video tutorial, we're going to talk about rendering out of Maya. And so there's a few things that we're going to go over in terms of, we're going to show how to render, find your render settings, use render layers to kind of kick out multiple options. So in this video, we're going to kick out just a normal color pass, that looks something like that. And then we're going to also render out an ambient occlusion pass and a wireframe pass to show you how you can kind of have a render of your model and then have a nice wireframe render that'll look good in your portfolio that kind of shows off how you made it essentially. And so let's get started. So first thing that you'll notice is my workspace is a little different than normal. And so up here where it says workspace, switch it from whichever work mode you're in into rendering standard to get into the mode that I'm in right here. And so the way that this rendering standard workspace is I have my perspective here, and you can see that I have a camera. So I created a camera and then I locked it. And so this is the lock button that I used on it to make sure that it doesn't move around. And so I'm going to be rendering out of my camera. And if you have questions about the camera, look back to my previous video. And so over here we have our render settings. And so the way that you get to this window normally is by clicking on this button where my cursor is. And so that just, in this, we'll kind of go over what to change in these tabs and how to adjust that. Over on the left side of the page, we have the render setup. And so this is where we create our render layers. And so basically we're going to do like a render layer pass, kind of like a group using that's like the color. We'll create another one that's for the wireframe and then another one for the ambient occlusion. And it's just a really nice way to kind of render these things out in a nice, efficient way. And once you get the hang of this view, it's really not too bad and it's super helpful. While you're using this, it'll be important to have your outliner up. And so having the outliner there is going to be helpful as well. So again, if you're not in the rendering standard space, you find the outliner under Windows and then outliner right there. Okay, so let's begin. So the first thing that we want to look at is I have my render here and just with the Arnold render view. And let's look at our render settings first. And so again, render settings, you can also get there with this icon right there. So we're just we have these several different tabs, and I'm under the common tab first. And here I'm just going to set a name for this. And so I'm just going to call this car demo. And we're going to choose the file format. And so you can kind of choose whatever you want. I generally prefer TIFFs here. And one thing that you'll want to decide with the TIFFs is, do you want an alpha or not? So that's right there. And so an alpha channel just means that you'll have transparency through this point right here. I like to have the alpha channel there as an option, and we'll kind of see more on that down the road. So continuing to move down, this is really important. It's going to, right now, it's set to render out of my perspective view. That needs to be my camera view. And down here, I'm going to leave this as is just for this online demo, but however, for you, you're probably going to want to kick this out at a higher resolution setting, something like a 4K option or something like that. You can see this is set by 960 by 540, which is basically SD, right? What TV used to be in, before 2005. And the reason that the resolution is so low is just so that while you're working on your projects, your renders will go quickly and you'll be able to preview, what you're doing and get a sense of what's going on. So that's why Maya has this really low setting by default. But when it's time to kick out your renders, you're going to want this to be, much larger than this, right? So think about like 4K resolutions, at least HD resolution. So we have some presets up here, but you can also just type in whichever number you like. And so again, I'm just going to leave it just so that my renders continue to move quickly as we talk here. So moving over to the next tab, we have these sliders. And one thing that's nice that Maya has in this most recent iteration is it used to be when we rendered, this would come out looking really grainy. And what they've done is all the way at the bottom where it says imagers, they've added a default Arnold denoiser. So it's just an algorithm that kind of finds the noise and tries to get rid of it. I'm just going to hide this for a minute so that we can see this is what an Arnold render, used to look like. before we had the denoiser. And so that's a really helpful thing. So if the noise is in your render, make sure that's on. You can also over here go to add imager and you can add your own. And so the I call it the nice denoiser is in the past has been a good option for me. But you can see there's several options. There's other effects you can add as well under the imagers. And so one thing that you can do is you can turn this off and you can kind of see what these settings are doing a little bit as we're working. And so right here, these are sliders that adjust certain parameters within your scene. And so which sliders you want to push up depend on your scene. So for this one, so we have camera AA, so that's anti-aliasing, so the kind of the samples. And so by default it's at 3. Maybe you want to kick that up to 4. And sometimes you can go even higher here. And so basically it's just going to improve pretty drastically the quality of your render as you continue to push that up. But one thing to remember is just don't go crazy with the slider. So by default it was at 3. I just moved it at 4 for here. And this is not a linear slider, meaning that if I go to 4 to 5, it's the same amount of improvement from 4 to 5 as it is from 5 to 6. It's kind of exponential in a sense, and so I get a lot of returns just by moving it from 3 to 4, but I get less and less returns as I start to crank this up, and my render time starts to suffer pretty drastically. So don't go crazy with any of these sliders. I just maybe nudge them up 1 or 2 at a time depending on your scene. So that's the most important slider for me, I feel like. We have diffuse, which is basically the quality of the color pass. Specular is the quality of the specular highlights, right? These kind of white highlights that you might see around the scene, so you can boost that up. Again, I'm going to keep these pretty low because I want these renders to go quickly. In fact, I'm going to bring this back down just so that y'all aren't waiting all day for me to render, during this video tutorial. We have transmission, so the glass, the quality of the refraction in the glass. SSS stands for subsurface scattering, so this doesn't apply here because this is a car, but if you're modeling a human or and you're using subsurface scattering for your shaders, then that can be helpful. And then finally, volume indirect is the amount of times a light ray bounces within your scene. That can be really helpful if you have an environment, like a room or something like that, but this is just a product on a base, and so I feel like 2 light bounces are going to be good for me, but that it can look cool sometimes if you boost that up to 3. Again, I'm going to keep all these settings low and turn my denoiser back on so that we can have that back, so that these renders just kind of move quickly here as we talk. Okay, so those are the render settings. And let me just click back here. So under the Common tab, you should see, make sure that your project is set correctly. So you can see I have my project here, and all this work should go into your images folder within your project directory. So if your project is not set in the right place, just go to File and then Set Project and make sure it's going to the right spot, right? And so this is where you can check that. Okay, so that is render settings. And so next up, when it's time to render, I'm next going to talk about the render setup, so these render layers options. One thing that you can do is you could just go ahead and remember we're under the rendering standard workspace. You could go up to render and then batch render, and I could render out this image and export it out just like that without it using render layers or anything like that. And when I do that, you'll see the script editor will start to go, and this will kind of give me updates in terms of how the render is going. So that's why that is there. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to start showing render layers though, but just remember that there's a simple option you can do. And okay, so let's get started with render layers. So render layers happen under this render setup menu. So again, under the rendering standard workspace, it should show up there. But if you don't see it, it is this button right there that turns up this pop-up window. And so the way that this works is we create render layers, clicking on this button. And I'll just call this my color pass. And this eye icon will become clear in a minute once I have multiple render layers going. It just shows which of my render layers will show up, be visible in my scene, in my current displays in Maya. And then this button right here sets up which ones are going to export when I would click batch render. So if I turn that off, it's not going to batch render when it's time to export. So just kind of keep that in mind. So I'm going to turn that back on. And so first thing I need to do is I need to right click where it says color, and then I'm going to create a collection. And so when I create a collection, this window will pop up down below. And essentially what a collection is I'm trying to set what objects, what things will render within this render pass. And so hypothetically, if I just wanted to render the base of under my car in one render pass, I could just select that and then add it. And then that would be the only thing that would render in my scene. What I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to set up an overall color pass. So in my outliner, I'm just going to click on the very top item and then hold shift, drag to the bottom, and I'm just going to add everything into this. And so I'm just, again, shift select all that, and I'm just going to add it into that collection. And so now when I render this, it should render everything in the scene. It should render everything as a TIFF, and with all these settings that I've kind of enabled right there. So let's give that a try. So I'm going to go to render, and then batch render. Let go. And so this is going to need to think just for a moment. And so, yeah, it usually takes a second to get started. So you should see rendering with Arnold ... And it's kind of setting up the render. And I'll go ahead and go over to my project folder. So I have my project folder, and then these should show up in your images folder when they render. All right, so you can see the render is starting to go. And again, I tried to keep my render settings low just so we wouldn't be sitting here all day waiting for, these renders to go, because I just want you all to see the techniques. But you should have some things boosted a little bit in terms of the resolution and all that. And so your renders, most likely will take a little bit longer than what mine are doing. It just really depends on your scene and how much is in it and kind of what you're going for there. So you can see under my images folder, I have two things show up. I have under my master layer, so that's kind of up here and by default in the scene, and then I kind of have my color path that I just set up there. So I have my color pass render. And so some things you'll see is the resolution's not super high right now. So just kind of keep that in mind. But you can see that I have an alpha channel. I'm on a Mac, and if you tap spacebar, you should have like some translucency if you have an alpha channel. Okay, so and if I don't want an alpha channel, I can click on that button in my render settings, or I could export out as like a JPEG or something like that. Okay, and so now what I want to do is, and so we kind of have our color render right there. And so next up, let's start thinking about our ambient occlusion pass and our wireframe pass. And so what I'm going for is a certain technique that'll give us a nice look, that'll look good in your portfolio for displaying a wireframe of your model, kind of showing how you made it essentially, and kind of presenting it in a nice light. So first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create another render pass, and this one's going to be an ambient occlusion pass. And something that I want to do with this is, if I rendered this out right now with an ambient occlusion, it would have that black background behind it. And so what I want to do is I want to add something new in my scene. I basically just want to create a background back there. So I'm just going to go to Panels, Perspective, and just go to my Perspective view. And I'm just really quickly, I'm just going to create a plane, just a real simple plane. I'm going to rotate it, and I'm going to hold J while I rotate to make sure it goes to 90 degrees. Scale it up. That's not 90 degrees. Let's try that again. So J, there we go. And so you can see it's almost covering up my entire background. Sorry, my shortcut stopped working. There we go. So I'm just covering up the background so that that's not black when we go to do this next. Okay, and then I'm just going to call this backdrop. That's not how you spell. Okay, backdrop. Okay, so All right, so let's get started with the ambient occlusion pass. So on this one, I'm going to create another render layer. I'm just going to call this AO for ambient occlusion. And there's just going to be one more step involved. This is really similar to the first one that I set up, but we're just going to add one more step. So I'm just going to right click, create a collection. And so remember, when you're creating a collection, you're setting which items are going to render. And with an ambient occlusion pass, I can basically just select everything again. One thing I might like to do is just select all my objects that are in my scene, like that, and just make sure that everything's selected. And then I will add that into my collection. And so here's the trick where it gets, there's just one more layer to this. So I have my collection right there. And what we're going to do is we're going to create what's called a material override on this. And so instead of these materials showing up in my render, instead we're going to create ambient occlusion materials and render those out instead. And so I'm just going to, not on the group or on the render pass, but under the collection or on the collection, I'm just going to right click, and then I'm going to go down to create material override. Okay, and so this should show up at the bottom, and we're going to create an override material. And so basically, if I click on this checkerboard box, it's going to bring up my hypershade, and in my hypershade, I can choose a material here, and whatever material I choose, it's going to replace it on all of my objects on that ambient occlusion render pass. And so there's a really nice shader for ambient occlusion. It's under Arnold, Shader, and then ambient occlusion right there. And one trick I can do is I can turn on the visibility. Remember, this eye gives us a preview of whichever render pass that we're currently on. So I turned on the eye for ambient occlusion, and now I can see it within my scene. And if I want to make adjustments to the ambient occlusion shader is going to is showing up in my hypershade. So I can click on that, and I can change the attributes of it. So you can increase like the samples, so that'll kind of make it a little less grainy and give you a little more resolution. You can change the spread and a lot of other items here. Let me just kind of minimize that a little bit. So the spread, if I bring that in, you can see you can kind of get sharper passes right there. I really like this the way that it is. One thing you might want to do is you could take the samples and just boost that up a little bit. But again, the denoiser is doing some nice work on this, and so you don't need to go crazy with it or anything. For this tutorial, I'm going to leave it at 3 just so that our renders keep moving. And one thing you'll notice, since I created that background, I have that white back there, and that'll just look a whole lot nicer in the end render than if this was just like a black background. So that's why I created this plane that's selected right there. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a render pass of this one. And so remember, these little film clap icons right here, these are indicating what's going to render if I click batch render. So I already rendered the scene and the color, so I don't need those for this one. And so I'm just only rendering the ambient occlusion. And so same thing, just up at the top, render, batch render, and Maya's going to think about it for a little bit. And I'll go ahead and look under my Finder. So you can see it created the ambient occlusion folder. And did it finish already? All right, let's see here. Yeah, that was quick. So the ambient occlusion should be faster than your normal render. And so that's what it looks like. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a wireframe render, and we're going to use a multiply in Photoshop to superimpose it on top of this. And it should end up looking really nice, hopefully. So, all right, so next up, let's do one more. So under the render layers, we're going to basically do the exact same thing we did with the ambient occlusion, but instead of the ambient occlusion shader, there's a really nifty wireframe shader that we're going to use. So I'm just going to create a new render layer with this button, and I'm just going to call this wireframe. Oops. And so we're going to right click and then create a collection. because I don't want the wireframe to show up on everything, right? So I now have this object that's behind my car, for instance. Like I don't, I don't want that in this collection, right? And remember, with these collections, if I wanted to just render like just my tire, I could just select my tire and add that into the collection, and then that would be. Let me just preview this. Oops. Then that would be the only thing that would render in my scene if I were to do that, right? So let me just turn back on the visibility on this. And so what I want to do is I want to select all the objects in my scene, but I don't want the wireframe on that back wall. And I don't really want the wireframe on my base, I don't think either. Like, I think it could end up looking cool just on only on my car, right? So I'm just selecting just the wireframe of my car. Oh, and this is one thing that'll be really important is you're just going to want to go ahead and press 1 on your keyboard. So select everything and press add. And you'll want to press 1 on your keyboard. And I'll show why in just a moment here. So I'm going to intentionally not press 1 just so you can kind of see what happens if you forget. So now that we've done that, so we have the wireframe render pass. We have we created our collection of objects. And then I'm going to right click and I'm going to do another material override on the collection. So material override. And same as before, I'm going to click on this checkerboard and that's going to bring up the hypershade. And under Arnold and then shader, there is a, where is it? There it is, the AI wireframe shader. So I'm just going to click that option. And so let's preview that. So remember, we have the I button that shows which render pass is active. And so we can see the wireframe. And so one thing you'll immediately notice is this is in triangles right now. The other thing you'll notice is that my mesh is incredibly dense. And so remember, I forgot to press 1 intentionally, right? So if I press 1, now this is a more accurate representation of my mesh. And so let's get this off of triangles. And so that's going to be really important to get this off of triangles. So remember, we can change the wireframe as a shader. So that's going to be in your hypershade view, which is, again, this button. And you can see my wireframe. So I'm just going to click on that and look over to the properties. And on the edge type, it's under triangles, and I just switched that to polygons. That's all I need to do. And so now we're in good shape on that one. Something else that I'm seeing is I had a little bit of fog in my scene or atmosphere, and I'm going to delete my atmosphere for this render. It might not show up and it might be fine, but I'm just to be safe, I want to just go ahead and delete that since I already have my other renders. This might be a good time to save your project, right? So go File, Save, and save your scene. And so that way you can kind of revert back if you want your fog to come back if you haven't. So to get rid of the atmosphere, it's in your hypershade up here in your library. So if you have atmosphere, this might be a good time just to delete that and get that out of the scene. And so there we go. So now we have a little bit of a cleaner thing happening. And looking at this, oh yeah, so on the wireframe, we had, so again, in the hypershade on the wireframe, I switched that to polygons. This is the fill color, the white. This is the line color. You can change the line width. So if you want the lines to be thicker than usual, you can just increase it there. 1 is pretty good. I don't know, maybe like 1.4. Let's see. So 1 was the default. 1.4 looks pretty good. It's just going to depend on your scene, what looks best. And from here, I think we're ready to go. So this is a TIFF. We have the alpha channel. The alpha channel should, actually, let me think about that. I might not want that alpha channel. Let me think about that just for a second. We'll test it out. We'll experiment with this just a little bit. Okay, so I will, from here, I will render this out. So remember, I turn off that film icon, so now only my wireframe is going to render, and this render should go pretty quickly. So I just go to render and then batch render, and remember the script editor is going to show us how the progress is going. So it's now thinking about it. I'll go ahead and, there we go, open my project window. And so in my images folder, that should show up. Okay, so I think that should be good. We'll test it out. So I think this is now ready to start bringing into Photoshop. One thing that I might want to do just right before I send this to Photoshop is, so we have our scene render layer at the top. This color pass was a little superfluous, but I just wanted to kind of show you the process. So with the scene selected, I'm just going to skip the alpha on one pass and press 2, just so that I have an option where that alpha pass isn't there. And I'm going to hide that background and reintroduce my atmosphere really quickly. So you remember I deleted that atmosphere. So there's probably a more efficient way for me to do that, but I'm just going to re-add it. And I remember pretty well what I had going there. I think it was 0.015. Maybe it's a little bit less. You know, just something really subtle is what I had. Okay, so the main thing is I just wanted to kind of give myself a pass where I skipped the alpha on that one, and so I just named this car demo 2 so that I just have a second iteration of it, and then I only set it on my kind of overall. It's going to show up as like the master scene in my images folder at the top, and so I'm just going to render, batch render, and that'll just make it so that I have that just as a backup. You know, it's good when you get into the compositing stage just to kind of give yourself, you know, a couple good options that you can deal with. And so as that's rendering in the background, let's just go ahead and get some of this open. So that's how you render out of Maya. And so now I'm going to jump over to Photoshop, and let's switch over to a more compositing frame of mine. And so under the master layer, you can see that TIFF just showed up. Oh, no, it didn't. Sorry, it's still working down here. And let's just give this one more moment. I'm just going to quickly double check some of my assets that I've created here. Okay, so there we go. So by turning off that alpha, so skip alpha, that just gave me an option where I just have the background as it appears in my render without anything changed. And sometimes that can be, you know, nice to have. I think I did forget to smooth, so you know, there's a step I missed, but at least you can see the process. So anyway, let's get this going. So first off, so I mean, essentially we have our color render. One thing I want to show you is how you can kind of traditionally apply an ambient occlusion pass to that. So let's just go ahead, and I'm just going to open all of these, and so I'm just selecting them and then right-clicking and then open with Photoshop. And so right here you can see I have my wireframe on a nice alpha channel. I have that last render that I created. I have my ambient occlusion pass, and then I have my first render. So on the first render, you can see there's a little bit of funkiness happening on the end there, and that's because I didn't boost my render settings, right? So that's a good reason to boost your render settings. But one thing that's nice is I do have that alpha channel, so I can eyedrop to like a dark color, press G on my keyboard, I go to the paint bucket tool. Sometimes the paint bucket tool is hidden under the gradient tool right there. So I just click on that, drag that underneath, and I have, you know, I can composite my car into whichever scene that I want to. And so next, the ambient occlusion pass, so here it is. The way it's traditionally used, is you composite it with your color pass, use a multiply overlay, and it's a nice way to kind of just add definition in some of these edges. So it helps separate the car from the ground, for instance, or create definition on the separation between this car panel. And so I'm just going to duplicate this over into that other scene. So the way I do that is I just right here, I right click, and I go to duplicate layer towards the top. And typically if you just press OK, it'll just create a duplicate in this current image. And I'm just going to go over, and then I'm just going to copy it over into the first color pass right there. So drag it to the top. And so typically what somebody does, and I'll need to make adjustments to this, but is on a normal overlay, and then so you can kind of experiment with all these other overlays. Most of the time I've seen people do it, they've used the multiply and kind of bring it down a little bit. And if you kind of look at some of these car panels, I'll make it a little stronger. It just kind of adds a little bit of boost there. One thing that you might also notice is this ambient occlusion pass is a little bit gray. And so something we might want to do is adjust the levels on it to fine tune it. And so to adjust the levels on it, you could go up to image adjustments and change the whichever way you like to adjust your photos, right? Levels is what I like. We could do curves, any of these photo editing layers. But something else you can do, and when I'm compositing, I always try to work non-destructively. So if I added that effect directly onto this, it's kind of hard to undo it. And so what I like to do is I like to use adjustment layers. So that's this button in Photoshop. So I just click on that, hold it down, and you can see I can add a levels effect. It shows up as a layer. And if I change the levels here, it affects anything that's underneath it. Do you see that? So whatever layer is underneath my adjustment layer is going to be affected. But one trick that you can do is with the levels adjusted, so I selected right there, I can click on this button and it turns it into what's called a clipping mask. And so now that little arrow will show up to the left of it, and now it only affects the layer that's directly underneath it. And so from here, I can boost the brights by dragging the slider up, and you can see I have a histogram of the darks and the lights, and I can like boost up the darks to exaggerate that. And so I can really kind of get in there and fine tune my work. And what I like about it is that if I decide later I don't like it, I can just click the eyedrop button and the adjustment layer is gone, right? So it's really helpful. And so again, multiply on the ambient occlusion pass, kind of make adjustments to it, right? We can do all kinds of things with masks in Photoshop and really get in there and fine tune this. Okay, so I could spend all day working on that, but let's move on to the wireframe. Okay, so we have the ambient occlusion pass. I could do the exact same thing I did before where I can create an adjustment layer. So this button, and then I can go to levels. And so that'll just be there so that we can kind of fine tune this a little bit. Let's bring our wireframe on. So over here I have my wireframe. So I'm going to do the same thing where I right click on the layer, duplicate layer. And again, I right clicked right there and went to duplicate layer. I'm going to bring it into, which one of these is the ambient occlusion? I think it's that one. That is incorrect. Let's try that again. So I guess it's the second project. Okay. So duplicate layer and there. Okay, so I have my wireframe. And so let's experiment with overlays. And so we have these different overlay modes on here. And really it's just to taste, which one of these that you think is going to look best on your work. Soft light is a nice one. It's kind of subtle. Let me just turn off my adjustment layer underneath it. And so you can see like soft light, it just kind of adds like a little bit of, superimposes the wireframe on top. We could do multiply and just kind of take, I think that's probably the best one. So multiply, maybe take it down to 50% opacity right there. Right, and so we can just kind of continue to make adjustments to this. And so the reason for doing this is, so for your final render, so you'll have an option that's like this. We have your wireframe, and so again in your portfolio, this is really nice to have this. So let's just say this is the final portfolio, is I have this render of my image, and then I have this render of my image. And so what this does is having that wireframe just kind of shows to a client or just somebody looking at your portfolio like, hey, like I made this thing. And it's, hopefully got like a clean mesh on it. So like a potential employer or a collaborator can see, all right, this person knows how to model correctly. And if I import one of their models into my scene, it's going to be laid out in a nice way that'll kind of work with my overall project. And then for a layman looking at your work, a layman, depending on the quality of your render, a layman might look at this and just think, oh, they snapped a picture of a car, great, But something that this does is it just kind of gives a peek behind the curtain, shows kind of the work and the construction that had to go into making your model, your artwork, right? And so it's just a really cool trick, and you can render this out in turnarounds, right? So today we were working on stills, but we could export videos of this work. Um, and for future reference, if you're just trying to render a video rather than an image, like what we were doing today, is today we were working under name extension single frame. And if you switch this to name number and extension right there, give it a frame padding of 4, and then down here you set the range of your animation. So if you want 10 frames of animation, you do that. If you want 200 frames of animation, you know, it just depends on how long your animation is. You do that. And when you click render batch render, it'll render out a image sequence, or in other words, a movie of your entire animation, right? So this whole technique I've been showing is applicable, exactly the same, just with that one difference right there, for still images or video.